Okay, so in this video, we're going to take a look at some supply and demand graphs and deal with prices and quantities and taxes and subsidies. I'm going to say this, that some of this material may not appear on the AP macro test, particularly the information about producer surplus and consumer surplus and deadweight loss and that kind of thing. And I'm actually going to go ahead and do those parts now, even though they're actually related to a topic in Unit 2. So this material is going to jump ahead a little bit, and some of it's not necessarily going to relate to macro, but I'll kind of point that out as we go through it. So the first question says draw an effective price ceiling and label the following, and I've already managed to kind of sully that down the corner. I'm going to draw these off to the side. If you have your own sheet of paper, I would encourage you maybe to try these on a blank sheet as well. And first we need price and quantity, and then demand and supply. And I'm going to do these kind of nice and big off the margins for you, but you probably have a little bit more control on a piece of paper. And so we have PE and QE that we're going to label here, QE and PE, and then it says price ceiling. Now, a price ceiling needs to actually appear below the equilibrium price, and that's a little counterintuitive, but it's the idea that the price can't go above that PC value. If it does, it's going to bump into that, and it says, no, you can't go up to price equilibrium. If we were to choose a price ceiling value that was really high, it just wouldn't have any effect. So now with this value, our quantity supplied here is QS, and our quantity demanded is here, QD. And so we have what we call a shortage. Right, a shortage. And so then we have some deadweight loss and consumer surplus and producer surplus. I'm going to switch to some different colors for that. So the first one is to know the quantity that we actually consume is this quantity right here. That's the quantity that we consume. And so these transactions don't happen. So we would call this the deadweight loss. And that's the value of the transactions that aren't going to occur. Now, this information, I'm just going to note and annotate right here, is not on the macro test, but it does appear extensively on micro exams. Now, we're going to switch colors one more time here, and we're going to say this still also has consumer surplus after the control and producer surplus after the control. And again, this is helpful more if you actually already understand surpluses, which is in Unit 2. So after the price control, the consumer surplus goes from the price, which is actually here, right? The price is here, and it goes all the way up to what they were willing to pay. So it's this entire box. A price ceiling is usually, really good for consumer. Sorry about that. So what we were saying is that it typically is really good for consumers. And so this is the consumer surplus. And then we're going to see how it really isn't that good for the producers because it goes from the price down to the supply curve. And so they don't get very much in terms of producer surplus because the price is capped, is another way to think about it. So now we're going to switch gears and look at a price floor, and it's going to look relatively similar actually, but instead of having a really low price, it's going to be a really high price. And so it's going to benefit the suppliers. So supply and demand, and again, my apologies for kind of being sloppy here, but I'm still getting used to this, QE, PE, and a price floor is going to have to be way up here or else it won't be effective. And then once again, we're going to label QD this time. There's not very much demand at a really high price, but there's also quite a bit supplied. So we end up with what we call a surplus, right? A surplus. Now, then we're going to switch gears and shade in the deadweight loss. And it's going to look the same because this is the quantity of transactions, right? There's only that many that are actually going to get bought and sold. So the value of the transactions that don't happen is defined by the demand curve down to the supply curve and over to that quantity that should be happening. So it's the lost transactions. Then we're going to say here, we'll switch back to green for consumer surplus goes from the price, which is up here, up to the demand curve. So you can see it's really small, right? Consumer surplus is really, really small, but the producer surplus is much, much larger now. And that's because the price is so high, but they would be willing to do it for this very low price. So all of that is the producer surplus. Now we're going to switch and take a look at a quota, and then we're going to do a tax and a subsidy. So I'm going to erase a little bit of some of this messiness here. And so to start us off, we're going to see a quota. Okay, and I know I'm actually going to run out of space here, actually. So I hope you bear with me on these. You're going to have, whoops, I should probably draw supply and demand first. Demand and supply and PE and QE, right? QE. And the amount after the quota, and we'd say quota is here at Q max, that's a quantity control. It says that's the amount that you're allowed to sell. You can't sell anything more than that. And the price the buyers pay is going to be what are they willing to pay at Q max? Well, the demand curve all the way up here is going to tell us the price the buyers pay. So the buyers are going to pay that really high price up there, and that's going to change a little bit of some of the surpluses and things. So let's take a look here. The per unit quota rent is actually the distance between the supply curve and this point right here at Q max and up to here, P buy. So this is the per unit. And the total amount of quota rent is the idea of how much benefit do the sellers get from having this quota. So this is actually part of the producer surplus, but it's the specific part that's a result of the quota. And that's the total quota rent. So that's this, right? Then we're going to shade deadweight loss, and it's going to look like the same as the others because this is the value of the transactions that didn't happen. So that's deadweight loss. And now consumer surplus after the tax, or after the quota, so I'm going to have to go in and change that. These are quotas, right? That's going to be this tiny little bit up here. And that's because the price the buyers pay up to the demand curve is the consumer surplus. Now, the tricky part with this one is going to be the producer surplus. So we're going to switch back to the color here. And we're going to find that the producer surplus includes all of that total quota rent, and it goes all the way down here. So it's both the total quota rent and the amount that you might expect. And that's because that's how much they get from these transactions that they otherwise wouldn't, that weren't part of their costs, is a way to think about that. Okay, now we're going to switch and do taxes. We're going to see what taxes do here. And actually, I'm going to erase a little bit here so that this information is out of our way. Because there's just not quite enough with me doing it all on my screenshots here. So we'll start here with a per unit tax, and we'll show the following: quantity and price, and we're going to have demand and supply. And just like before, we're going to start with a QE and a PE, and that's the equilibrium values. And a per unit tax is going to shift the supply curve to the left. So we're going to say S tax. So shifts to the left. And the new price is going to be up here. That's what we're going to call P1. That's the price the buyers are going to pay. And the quantity gets reduced. Now, the tricky part is to know a couple of things about this, is that the amount of the tax, the per unit amount of the tax, is not from PE to P1. It's actually the vertical distance between these two supply curves. So we would say here down to here is the per unit amount. So that's because this curve actually is shifting, technically it's shifting up by the amount of the tax. So the per unit is the vertical distance between the S and the S tax curve. Then it says total tax revenue. We're going to switch colors here because all total tax revenue is just the quantity times the per unit tax. And so if the per unit tax is from here to here, then we go over to the quantity, this amount defined by this box is the per unit tax. And so, or the tax revenue, sorry, not the per unit tax. That's the total amount of money the government gets to keep from this tax. Then we're going to say the deadweight loss. And again, it's in the same spot. It's the value of the transactions that aren't happening. So it's these. That's the deadweight loss. And we're using the same color each time. So deadweight loss. And then we've got consumer and producer surplus, and we're going to show those in basically the same spot that they used to be. And I know I've used the same color now twice, but I was kind of running out here. Consumer surplus goes from the price the buyers pay, which is P1, down to, or up to, excuse me, the demand curve. But producer surplus is a little bit trickier in this one, and I'm trying to choose my color already. It goes from the price the sellers get to keep to the supply curve. So this PS value is like the price the sellers get to keep. That's the producer surplus, is that triangle. Remember, the sellers don't get to keep all that tax revenue that's generated. So it actually, this one is taking away from both the producers and the consumers. And later on in Unit 2 and Unit 3, we can look at tax incidence to see who pays more. Now, the last question on this video is about subsidies. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit, and we're going to draw a subsidy to show what that looks like. And it looks very similar to the tax. So it's going to shift the supply curve, but it's going to look a little bit different. Q and P, and then we're going to do demand and supply. And then we got some dots to show here. We've got QE and PE. And what we can say here is that a subsidy increases the supply curve. So this is S subsidy, and it's actually in the per unit amount of the subsidy, right, is kind of the vertical distance here. And it actually kind of reduces the cost of production. That's why we say it's going to shift the supply curve, is because it's a per unit. It reduces the production costs on a per unit basis. Now, that makes the new price way down here for the buyers, right? That's the value that the buyers have to pay. And the new quantity is Q1. But the amount of the subsidy we've already labeled. Here's where things get a little tricky. So what's the amount that actually the sellers get at Q1? Well, they get P1 plus the value of the subsidy. So they get all of this stuff too. This is how much the sellers get to keep. They get PS. And the difference between P1 and PS is the amount of the subsidy. So even though the buyers are paying P1, the sellers get to keep actually up here at PS. So I'm asking you here to show either consumer or producer surplus, because you can't really do both on the same graph. So let's go ahead and see, what would producer surplus look like? Well, it's from the price the sellers get, which is way up here, down to the original supply curve, because that's kind of what their willingness to produce it would be. So this amount is the producer surplus. Now, it's a little tricky because I'm going to try to show you both of them on the same graph. The consumer surplus is the price they pay up to the original demand curve. So you can see that actually the surpluses kind of overlap in this graph. And it's really wonky to think about, but it's really a representation of a concept more than anything here. And so that changes the producer and the consumer surplus, and it makes them both much happier. And you can imagine when the government's giving out free money, that's what a lot of times people would want. One last additional thing that I didn't throw on here is deadweight loss, and that's the transactions that shouldn't be happening that are. That's this. It's kind of weird. It points the other way. And then I'm going to throw one more messy thing on here. Let's see if I can get a color that I haven't used. This is the amount that the government spends on the subsidy in total, and it's this box. So I'm going to show you the whole box here is actually how much the government is spending on the subsidy, and that's really just Q1 times the subsidy is the whole amount that the government spends on the subsidy. So it's similar to the tax revenue box, but it's bigger, obviously, in this case. So hopefully this helps you make sense of some of the ideas related to taxes, subsidies, and price controls. I'll see you next time.